Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, as required by Maryland law, submitted new congressional and state legislative maps to the General Assembly last Friday on November 5th. The following Monday, the Legislative Redistricting Advisory Commission, created by the General Assembly, released 4 draft concepts of its own for congressional maps for public comment. As noted in the Baltimore Sun, Maryland's congressional map has repeatedly been criticized and challenged in court for benefiting unfairly Democrats in a state where Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1. Democrats hold a 7-1 advantage over the GOP in the state 8 U.S. House seats. Mike, the General Assembly will meet in will meet in December in a special session to finalize the map. What's the likely outcome? We saw a lot of litigation over the last iteration of the maps, and if you look at the old map, it's very tortured the way the districts were drawn. Are we going to see something similar?
Probably yes and yes. I think we'll likely see a lot more litigation, and I think that we'll continue to see the gerrymandering that we've seen in the past, which I think is unfortunate. And unfortunately, we continue to see it in other states doing the exact same thing. So whether it's Texas or North Carolina or Maryland, depending on which side of the line you are, if you're an R or a D, you're going to take the opportunity to draw the lines in your favor, which is the excuse everybody uses to do it because everybody else is doing it. And I think that becomes really problematic. At some point, we have a couple states that have actually put this to commissions that have been bipartisan and have come up with something that is much more standardized, much more uniform, keeps communities together, actually looks like a map that most of us would look at and say, oh, okay, I understand why I'm voting here, as opposed to having lines that cut across an entire state. And I'm hopeful that we can get to that point, but in the conversations I've had with folks, I think litigation is going to be the word of the day by the end as we move through this process.
You know, Mike, I love using this example. I had to give a speech up in Carroll County to the Republican Central Committee there a couple of years ago. And I mentioned that Jamie Raskin was my congressman, and they responded that he's their congressman as well. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that Silver Spring Tacoma Park has any relationship to Carroll County seems absurd.
Congressman Trone is living in Potomac and representing Hagerstown and Washington County.
Well,
you got to sit there and scratch your head and go, I don't understand.
Trone is sitting on his throne at the liquor store, I guess. Anyway, Mark, all reports are the General Assembly will target Congressman Andy Harris for defeat by adjusting his district boundaries to include more liberal precincts in Anne Arundel County. Is Harris a dead man walking?
Well, I don't know about dead men. I mean, it's certainly, if you know District 1, it's a very conservative area. So it will be moved up to a D, whatever the number is, a more Democratic leaning one. I just think there's always, we assume a lot about redistricting and gerrymandering, but it's also important to remember that during wave elections, there's a tendency for some of these assumptions to be kind of blown past, and people get elected sort of beyond what the numbers are. And I'd point, we just mentioned David Trone. After November's election, the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee added District 6 as one of their targets. And as you mentioned, it's in one of those areas that's got some very, very Republican, very conservative areas tied in with Montgomery County. So there can be a, how shall I say, a phenomena of being overly aggressive in redistricting and coming back and finding yourself surprised. So we may see ourselves with 2 Republicans rather than 0.
Well, do you have a candidate? Who's your candidate? I mean, doesn't it fundamentally come down?
In District 6, I think Neil Parrott is head and shoulders ahead of the other candidates. So yes, in 6, without question, I think.
And Neil's a current delegate, is that?
He's a current delegate, yes.
So he's had experience. I mean, I think.
And over the years, he's spent a lot of time in Montgomery County and is very familiar with the area. So
I think David Trone has done a good job, and I think he's been pretty formidable. I mean, I still question. I think when you have a district drawn like that, it does beg the question, and I think it certainly does look like an opportunity from someone from the other party, because you sit there and go, how do these pieces come together? How do we get downtown Potomac to look like Hagerstown? And it doesn't make any sense. And so
Yeah.
I think it also I'll be curious to see. I think there's an allure. I think there's a bit of a siren song that you hear, because people look at this and go, well, of course this is gettable. I think David's done a good job. And I think his struck a reasonable tone that reflects kind of the moderation of that district. But I think it still calls into question why we have a district that looks like that in the first place.
Well, I mean, his isn't the worst. I
Oh,
mean,
not at all.
Yeah, I mean, Sarbanes' district was far crazier than David Trone's.
We said it at the outset, but it's worth noting that while the federal courts have deferred to the states on districting, there are state provisions that can be challenged in the Maryland courts. That's really where the main judicial combat is going to be over these districts. And the creation of the Hogan, the commission that's had hearings, that's solicited input, provides, I think, a very positive, good alternative that the courts can look at. So they don't have to do the line drawing themselves. But
before we leave, Mike, the legislative process is this. The General Assembly, as I understand it, has to vote on the district or the maps. And then that recommendation, of course, is subject to veto by the governor. And of course, the current General Assembly is kind of veto proof. So is that the process?
That as I understand it, and that's the process. So stay tuned, and hope springs eternal. I'd like to think that we could actually get a bipartisan approach and actually get something that looks more rational.